Hello, everyone. In these trying times, I'm essentially going to be speaking about how we can still provide a high intensity neuromuscular strength training stimulus to our athletes, in particular the athletes that have limited equipment available to them. So, this talk is really about flattening the slope, and in this particular instance, I'm referring to the slope of detraining. Through Issurin's work, we know that we can retain certain physical qualities for a period of time. For example, maximal strength here seems to be retained for around 30 days after the cessation of strength training. But speed down here seems to have more of a use it or you use it or lose it type effect, where you essentially need weekly doses to be able to keep speed at a certain level. So similar to speed, power also seems to get hit a little bit harder than strength. For example, have a look here at a detraining group. After the final week of training, 3 to 4 weeks later, we see a drop in strength. When we look at their power scores, upper body power, we can see an even greater drop in power. Same sort of thing goes for, again, this detraining group with leg strength. We see a drop in strength, but then in leg power, an even greater drop in power. So the detraining effect and essentially the retraining effect also can be a little bit more dramatic in those who are less trained, perhaps our academy athletes or our draftees, for example. Their normal trajectory of improvement, which is quite rapid, is obviously halted. With 3 weeks of detraining, they obviously have some level of regression back to their old abilities. And it can take a good 6 weeks to come back and catch up to where they would have been without the cessation of training. So it poses a bit of a problem here when we're trying to get younger players ready for senior footy or senior rugby or senior hockey, whatever it might be, when we have these dramatic changes to the program in terms of their neuromuscular development. With our highly trained athletes, after about 24 weeks of hard slog, perhaps a pre-season, as depicted in this graph here, well, they can certainly lose quite a lot of their strength within 4 weeks of detraining. However, because of the years and years of training under these guys' belts, their floor, so essentially their baseline, is actually still quite high. It actually reminds me of a time back when I worked in rugby. I was working with a young centre. He had an inside centre. He had joined our club and he was essentially benching around about 140 kilos. So he was already a strong guy. But over the next 4 years, we got him up to about a 215 kilogram bench press. So really significant gains there. And he ended up retiring when he was about 27 or 28, if my memory serves me correctly. And he stopped training completely. Didn't even run, didn't do anything, didn't do any lifting. And I ended up seeing him at a wedding a year later and caught up with him, had a good old chat. And that's when he told me he pretty much let himself go and he was looking in pretty bad shape. But I gave him a little challenge, having not lifted for a whole year. Got him in the gym for 2, maybe 3 sessions just to slowly get him back into lifting, bench pressing again, getting rid of DOMs and that sort of thing. And about 7 days after his reintroduction to strength training and bench pressing, he ended up getting a triple at 150 kilograms. So that's a year after not training at all, but many, many years of training under his belt. So essentially with our elite, highly trained athletes, their floor, their baseline levels don't necessarily drop all the way back to almost a pre-training stage, which is a positive thing, no doubt. However, so what we're talking about here when we're talking about flattening the slope, we essentially want to get less of a decline in the detraining component. Now, we're naturally going to do that because our athletes are still doing some sort of training. We've all gone out and prescribed certain exercises that they can do. Some of us have been lucky enough to get equipment out to our athletes where they can train pretty well, similar to what they were doing at the clubs that we were generally seeing them at. However, some simply haven't. I know personally there's a few athletes of mine that haven't got equipment based on where they're living and where they are around the country. But ultimately, we're doing some sort of training. So, by and large, even our less trained athletes, we're still decreasing that training slope slightly by doing some sort of training. Some of our younger athletes probably have a lower baseline and they'll probably drop further down. But ultimately, we're already, with the programs we've sent out, already around that blue line now, where we're just decreasing, we're flattening that slope a little bit. However, my challenge is, are we doing lots of lower load exercises that don't stimulate the neuromuscular system enough? If we can apply high neuromuscular stimuli, can we then get a much flatter slope? And for even some of your athletes, can we potentially continue to develop their neuromuscular system by applying some high intensity strength training methods, despite having the amount of equipment that we normally have access to? Specifically for those situations where we have a lack of load, well, there now becomes an imbalance to our training. Formerly, we had enough load to be able to stimulate the neuromuscular system really well. But now without that load, we have lower neuromuscular stimulus, and we kind of try and make up for it by doing high volume work. And with that high volume work, we have less mechanical tension, clearly a lower stimulus for the neuromuscular system. We now recruit lower threshold motor units as a preference, and we have low firing frequencies as we do those particular exercises. Now, there's been a clear shift. And my question is whether we can, without training equipment that we normally have available to us, can we still provide a really high neuromuscular stimulus to decrease or flatten that slope, or in fact, improve our neuromuscular performance, particularly if we're going to apply new stimuli to our training environment. It's not just about neuromuscular performance per se, though. It's also about reducing injury risk. Now, we've all seen this graph before. We know that after this NFL lockout period, there was a huge spike in Achilles tendon ruptures. And ultimately, we can put ourselves at the moment in this sort of similar type of bracket. We'll come off of a break eventually when the restrictions are lifted, and we'll have a small amount of time to reintroduce our players to load and then get them into their regular seasons. With that, could mean a huge spike in tendons, muscle, and even bony injuries. So we need to be ready for that, and we need to be essentially putting them through high enough stresses in their training environments now, even if they don't have equipment available to them. We also have this threat of congestion. We know that we may be having to fit multiple games in a week, similar to kind of the soccer exponents in the European leagues. We may well have to put multiple games together in rugby league, rugby union, and also AFL, and perhaps other sporting codes to get our season in a smaller time frame. With that in mind, our players need to be able to cope now on increased demands. And from some of Paul Tafari's recent work, we can see that actually having a better, more efficient, stronger, robust neuromuscular system, you can guard against fatigue and muscle soreness, particularly in congested playing periods. So it's not just about neuromuscular performance. This is also about mitigating against injuries and also being able to let our athletes and players being able to tolerate these congested match fixtures that may occur to be able to get our season in within the timeframes of this year. So, what do we need? Well, this is pretty much it. All from Bunnings. Nice bar size dowels. They're quite sturdy. Towel or a bathroom mat, if you like. Some tie downs. Some nice strong ones. This green one's here is about 400 kilos. This blue one's about 200 kilos. Some webbing. With the webbing, you can put some slip knots in it and make it into a makeshift weightlifting straps. Water bottles, tin cans full of water. Water bottles full of water, tin cans, a nice bottle of Penfolds there as well, and a nice big backpack. I think all of this weight in my backpack adds up to about 25 kilos in total. So that's all the equipment you need. You also need some sort of barrier or fence in this sort of configuration. So 2 horizontal poles like this. You might have to search around, but you'll find it somewhere. Another barrier or post fencing like this, where there's just 1 horizontal pole. And a trusty car. I've already burnt 10 minutes, so let's get stuck in. 1 leg squats. Get off of the 2 legs and get onto 1 leg. There's just not enough load for 2 legs. With the rest of the exercise I'm going to go through today, this is perhaps the only opportunity you've got to work through relatively high loads through range. You go off the floor in a pistol squat, if you like. You can squat to a box. You can squat from a box, as my mate Aiden here from South Sydney Rabbitohs is doing. You can use load over your shoulders, on your shoulders, like the bag, for instance. You can hold load in your hands. However you can load yourself up in this exercise. Every additional load will be a considerable advantage for you in terms of strength development. And I'll go through a little bit about that in a second. Now, if you need stability in this exercise, for sure, grab onto something, hold a band, do whatever you need to do to get stable. Because remember, this isn't about control. This is about motor unit recruitment. So it's a strength exercise. It's not a stability exercise. Let's be very aware of that. Understand that in a 1-leg squat with no additional load, it's the equivalent of a back squat with your body weight on your shoulders. I'll explain that now. From segmental analysis, we know that the load above the hips is 68% of total body weight. Therefore, each leg makes up 16% of body weight. When you squat with both legs, each leg essentially shares the upper body weight, so 34% of upper body weight on each leg, and whatever additional load you carry. And they share that 50-50, obviously. 50% on one leg, 50% on the other leg. Now, when you squat with one leg, the one leg now takes all of the upper body weight, so 68%, and the free leg weight, so another 16%, 84% in total of body mass, and it takes 100% of every additional load you add onto the body. Now, we can see that an 80 kilogram athlete, for example, one leg squatting with, say, 25% of their body weight, so 20 kilos, we can see that they're actually working at around about an equivalent of a 1.5 times body weight back squat. Now, if we were able to raise that and say work at around 32 kilograms for this 80 kilogram athlete, if they're able to get 32 kilograms of additional load on them, say in the backpack, now all of a sudden we've got a very respectful kind of 1.75, 1.8 times body weight squat. Now, the same logic applies to our lower body power. We can get the same equivalent loading bilaterally by using this one leg. Yes, we'll miss our Olympic lift derivatives with high loads. We'll miss our jump squats with high loads. But we can make up for that by doing our power work on one leg. And of course, we have the added advantage of using our backpack to load that up fairly considerably for an explosive exercise. So here, demonstrated with the stretch shortening cycle, obviously. Concentric movement only now. Clearly more specificity for a acceleration-based exercise, but also taking the elastic energy contribution away and getting the musculature to work harder to produce the same amount of power. Now, we don't have to use a box. You can keep your athletes accountable by downloading different apps that can help you quantify power through jump height. Again, getting on one load, doing exercises like box strikes. Again, just making up for the lack of additional load by getting onto one leg and doing all your explosive movements off of one leg. And again, you can use that same formula to try and quantify what a 25 kilogram backpack would be like an equivalent double leg load. When it comes to heavy eccentric work, or more accurately, quasi-eccentric isometric type work, well, we need look no further than altitude landings. There's a number of different ways where we can increase ground reaction forces and essentially load when we're doing altitude landings. One is essentially the height that we're going to drop from. 2, adding any additional load. 3, how we land, whether it's on 2 legs or 1 leg. And more accurately, whether we land soft, medium, or very stiff landings. Here's an example, 80 kilogram athlete. If this athlete is landing from a 30 centimeter box and he's got 10 kilograms of additional load, he lands soft. It's about a 3.7 times body weight ground reaction forces. Pop him up 20 centimeters higher, so he's landing off 50 centimeters. He's now at about 4.8 times body weight ground reaction forces. So very similar to max velocity running. Now we can change that considerably by changing the way he jumps or lands, whether it's a medium landing or a stiff landing. We can stay at the same height, same load, but have a big increase, 5.6 and 11.1, depending on how stiff he lands. We look at changing the box height now, so 20 centimeters higher. All of a sudden, we can see comparative loading increases significantly. So let's have a look at some of these. So here, first one, a soft landing, if you like, both off of 50 centimeters, so about a 4.82 ground reaction forces. We can see it's soft with this sort of 110 degree knee bend. A much stiffer landing now, off 50 centimeters. So we can see that his forces are somewhere between 7 to 14 times body weight. Something you have to look out for here. This little sort of, if you like, cheating motion where you sort of stay on the box for a longer period of time and lower yourself gently. All of a sudden that changes the dynamic quite rapidly. So all of a sudden we're landing from a 40 centimeter box rather than a 50 centimeter box that we originally stood on, if you know what I mean. So we need to be sure that we're controlling for this as well. But anyway, a very, very good way to get really, really high loadings. You can see here, medium landing at 30 centimeters was already 5.6 times body weight, which is above that of ground reaction forces experienced at max velocity running even. So a great way to get the load. One of the things to be aware of, the higher this box goes, the more this starts to happen in an athlete. So the more they start lowering themselves down before they actually let go of the box in its entirety. So my preference is actually to add load rather than add height, because you just avoid this from happening as regularly as it does. Now for me, plyometrics and multi-jump activities have got to be in a high-intensity neuromuscular strength training program. Now, not just from a neuromuscular performance standpoint, but also from a tendon and bone adaptation standpoint. Now, if you don't currently have your athletes doing plyometric activities, now might be a good time to start without the other competing demands of training. The key is obviously to be able to coach them effectively using online format. So That's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is simply how you're going to progress your plyometrics. Being sensible with your progressions is absolutely key. So perhaps starting with exercises without any impact, where you're still developing the system to decrease that amortization phase and get rid of slack and understand how to preload. Use bilateral lower amplitude alternatives. Step up in intensity by increasing drop heights. And obviously get onto the one leg like we've just established to increase that load even further. But again, very dependent on where your athletes are coming out and what programs they've been on previously. But there's no reason they can't start doing really low amplitude pogos, for example. If you've already established a good base to plyometrics and they've got good KPIs in terms of their strength levels, then for sure utilize this time to put high intensity plyometrics in their program safely, because there's not many other ways of as potent as delivering a high intensity neuromuscular stimulus other than plyometrics and multi-jump activities. Now, if hurdle jumps and hops are your preferred choice of high intensity exercise, then of course it's pretty easy to makeshift some hurdles with using bags or cushions or creating some sort of barrier to be able to jump over. Isometric training. Now, isometrics has been around for a long time now. There's some really strong evidence out there for their use. Their effect on tendon stiffness has been shown to be comparable to plyometric training. They've been shown to improve power and also peak force. They've also been shown to transfer effectively over to running economy. And anecdotally, from my own work, I've also seen them support max velocity running in a really substantial way. Now, whether it's your flavor or not, unfortunately or fortunately, isometrics becomes a really important option for our training of our athletes now, particularly when they don't have much equipment and we still want a really high neuromuscular output. Now, the great thing about isometrics is you can pretty much cover the whole spectrum of training and neuromuscular stimuli. We can do maximal strength work. We can do work on power or rate of force development. We can also do hypertrophy work if that's your flavor. And we can also look at changing morphology of the tendon. Now, it's pretty exhaustive kind of training protocols I've put up here. So I'm not going to go through them all, but perhaps just look at some commonalities there that you can actually hit quite a few things at once. And another thing I want you to really have a look at is my explanations or my descriptors here of grind and explode. And that's essentially the intent that you use when you're executing a particular muscle action isometrically. So whether you're slowly building up gradually to a really peak value, that's what I describe as a grind, or whether you're intentionally trying to be as rapid and as fast as possible, I call an explode. Now, these two evidence shows that have a really, really different effect on your neuromuscular system. This one, really strong changes in peak force, and this one, really strong changes in rate of force development. A few other things to consider in terms of programming for isometric training. You've got the intensity of contraction to look at. You've also got how long you're going to hold your contractions for. You've got the total work that you're going to achieve throughout a set, for example. You've also got the length, the muscle length you're going to work in. So, for example, with hypertrophy training, long muscle lengths seem to be more advantageous. You can also see here total work. I tend to stick around 30, 40, no more than sort of 45 seconds for the maximal strength training, specifically if I'm training at 100%. If I'm training at lighter intensities, for sure I can go up to around 60 to 75 seconds. You can see here rate of force development. It's a fast, dynamic muscle action contraction over within a few seconds at max. And obviously, just like most power training and strength training, the volumes are relatively low comparative to hypertrophy type work. And the intensity is also in hypertrophy type work, just like in normal isotonic training, much lower in terms of muscle action intensity. So isometrics with an acceleration bias. Now this is where our car comes into use. So again, trying to find some sort of curb or some sort of ability to be able to push against so there's not a loss of friction and you don't slide your foot. For sure, you can turn this into an isotonic movement by just taking the handbrake off and whatnot and actually pushing the car a little bit. But for safety reasons, I'm just going to have it straight up here as an isometric. Now, you might have to change your position. This is the only position I can get into with my chest pretty much close to the bonnet. But of course, different configurations of cars might make you get into better acceleration positions or maybe not as effective acceleration positions. But for sure, working isometrically against this car provides a phenomenal stimulus. And you can see me chest on the bonnet and hands on the bonnet, finding a good position where I'm not going to be able to bend the bonnet, obviously. So looking for a good reinforced position and then pushing as hard as I can into the car. I also change that grip sometimes into more of a sort of a Zercher grip or a deadlift type grip where my arms are lowered down and I'm grabbing something underneath me and pushing through my chest. So great exercise there. The other thing is when we're looking at this sort of acceleration position, we're looking at a bent knee position and the soleus really being the key driver here or the key rudder in terms of where we're going to generate forces through our hips and knee against. So having a really stiff ankle. So here I'm just using a plank of wood here with my tie down over my knee and a nice towel to cushion that band from digging deep into my skin, if you like. So the towels there cushioning. Now, as I go through all these isometric exercises, you'll see me using different variations. You'll see me using different muscle lengths. You'll see me using different contraction times. But for the sake of this one, you can see me first of all grinding. So I'm working now, trying to plan a flex, and you'll see me come off the contraction, coming off. And now you're going to see me do more of an explosive version and then come off quite quickly. Again, the grinding, build. And now I'm off. And the explosive one. And now I'm off. Moving on to run-specific isometrics. So isometrics really specific to upright running and that mid-stance phase where we look at the ankle, the hip, and also the knee. Why we do this? Well, throughout stance phase, what we can see, the muscle tendon unit does go through some lengthening before it shortens again into flight. We can see that most of this lengthening is coming from the tendon, but in fact, muscle fascicles remain pretty constant length before they shorten into flight. So again, yes, muscle tendon unit lengthens throughout mid-stance and then into this flight phase. The tendon certainly is lengthening into flight and then shortening, but the muscle fascicles seems to remain fairly constant and then shortens into flight. That's a reason why we do this. Now, number of different exercises. Again, first of all, focusing around that ankle. So again, using my wooden lever, if you like, and also the tie downs over my shoulders. So this one at an ankle, a maximal effort, so a grind. Much more dynamic effort. Now in hip isometrics, you can see where I put my tie down underneath an immovable object like a chair or a sofa and then leaning on the sofa itself. And here, the knee push. Again, ankle iso push, grind effort. Ankle iso push, explode. Hip iso push. Knee iso push, now with the band under my foot. And finishing with an explode effort there. So you can see where I put my tie downs. First of all, under the block to utilize my ankle. Then around my hips, but under a heavy object that I can lean back on, like a chair or a sofa, for example. And around my hips for my hip iso pushes, and then my knee iso push directly under my foot. And just again, to stop that tie down digging hard into your shoulders and your skin, just cushion it with either a nice thick bath mat or a towel like I've done here. So it goes without saying, for a high neuromuscular stimulus, where it almost spits in the face of the force velocity curve, where we have high forces and high velocities, you should be sprinting. Your athletes should be sprinting. If you don't have a strong sprint program or sprint philosophy within your clubs or your franchises or your systems, then this is a probably good opportunity to start that happening. Again, just like plyometrics, you have to be careful with the loading here if you're brand new to sprint training. But sprint training, I seriously cannot think of a more powerful stimulus. And I've got some evidence here with a young sprinter of mine. He was about 21 years of age at this time, and we had gone through a period of time where we stopped bilateral squatting, where we was doing heavy eccentric work and unilateral work. We stopped the unilateral work completely here, so he actually had no more strength stimulus whatsoever moving on, and all he was doing was essentially sprinting and plyometrics for the rest of this period of time, which was about 8 to 10 weeks, if I can remember rightly. So here is his counter movement jump power. It just increased more and more and more, again, just with that sprinting and plyometric stimulus alone and no heavy lifting or explosive lifting with high loads. And when we look at his barbell jump squat, again, this was just one of my measuring tools, so he didn't train with this as such after this period of time. This was all, again, just sprinting and plyometrics, where he obviously continued to increase his power. So sprinting alone offering a very, very powerful neuromuscular stimulus in terms of being able to enhance both strength and power. And funny enough, this same sprinter, he had a bench press PB of around 120 kilograms. And after 3 months off racing and no upper body work at all, we had to be careful this upper body work because this particular sprinter could put on mass quite quickly. But after 3 months of racing and coming back, he managed to have a PB on his bench press of about another 7.5 to 8 kilogram PB on top of what his former PB was. And this was clearly off of no bench pressing at all for over 3 months. So sprinting alone, a really, really powerful driver for the neuromuscular system in a whole. Now, one way of making your sprinting safer is using the hills. Now, ultimately, with limited equipment, we don't have our sleds and our prowlers available to us anymore. So for sure, we can just use a hill and sprint up your hill. It's a safest form of sprinting, essentially. Yes, it stays mostly in acceleration, so clearly very different from max velocity. Nonetheless, a really potent stimulus and a way of getting around not having a sled or a prowler. Hill's pretty accessible to everyone in Australia, so being able to just find one and getting up it is going to be a great way of driving that really specific leg power for acceleration. Now, there's no surprise with all the Nordic hamstring exercise studies out there, we know that actually you can detrain pretty quickly off your Nordic hamstrings. We know that there's significant changes in fascicle length that occur in terms of shortening off a very short period of detraining. We know that muscle thickness can change pretty dramatically and very quickly after cessation of Nordic hamstring exercise. We also know that strength also decreases, similar to strength on any other of our exercises. So for sure, there's no excuse. Whether you are against Nordic hamstring exercises or for them, you should be doing this form of exercise now in lockdown, because it's one way of getting super maximal loads through your posterior chain. If you can't, for some reason, hook your feet underneath a bed or a couch to get your eccentric loading, then for sure do some sort of sliders. Hopefully most people have some sort of slippery-ish surface in their households where you can use socks or a towel of some sort and just be able to do your sliders using the floor itself. To create higher loadings with your sliders, of course you can use a band if you've got a band. Put that around your heel, put that around an object further away from you to create some overload. Or of course, use a partner. Let them put a band or a sock or something, a longer sock, a footy sock or something around your ankle, and pull you out into extension to give you more load in those sliding movements. Again, obviously, unilateral, providing more load than the bilateral exercise. Now, looking more at a focus around the proximal hamstring. Now, we've done our hip iso pushes before using our tie downs, and now we can go into more of a quasi-eccentric isometric movement, where you look at two different levels of iso switching here. A standard iso switch, which is less dynamic, and then a more advanced iso switch. So you'll see two of the differences here. So again, starting with a standard hip iso switch where there's a moment of load share between both legs, and then you'll see the difference in an advanced iso switch where for a moment of time there's no load share at all, and it's the one leg that comes into contact, trying to stop our bodies from dropping down, stop the hips from dropping down, fighting against gravity. So Aiden using whatever he can here. Again, a standard switch, small load share, and then he switches his legs over. And now an advanced switch where there's a rapid change of leg and there's a little bit of air time before we have to hit, collide, break the forces from dropping our hips down to the ground, providing a really high stimulus from an eccentric standpoint here around that whole chain, both distal and proximal. You can see Aiden here applying more load, so making it even more advanced by applying that backpack on his hip area. So, upper body work. We'll cruise through this real quick. I know I'm taking some time here. So horizontal pulls, looking at using barriers and tie downs. So first of all, of course, in this time we're in at the moment, making sure we're disinfecting everything. Not in a kid's playground here, but just finding something that's available and not locked off. So just doing the right thing here, making sure we're not transferring anything or anything's getting transferred to us. Here we go, using my zip cord, my makeshift weightlifting straps. Different muscle length, a little bit shorter. Bent over row, long length. A little bit shorter length. So there you go, some horizontal pull options from an isometric standpoint. Again, high loads there because I'm maximally exerting against immovable objects. And that dowel is thick and strong. I've cut it at different lengths, so the shorter lengths, obviously the stronger ones. Perhaps you're a lot stronger than me and you might be able to break it. But go speak to the hardware man and find out whether you've got a safe one that you can exert maximal forces up against. So vertical pressing now. Using a barrier again and a tie down, but this time a different barrier. So not with two horizontal bars now, just a single bar. First of all, a max effort followed by an explosive effort. So a grind and then an explode. Moving on to horizontal pressing now, using the trusty car. Make sure it's on, handbrakes are on. Using a barrier and also using tie downs. Explode. Using a tie down. Short range. And a longer range. Or to be more technically correct, I should say a long muscle action followed by a short muscle action. Before I discuss power push-ups, let's have a look at the load in a regular push-up. So in a flat push-up, about 70% of our body weight is supported at our hands. If we go into a 45-degree decline, we can see that that increases by 10%. And if we go into a 45-degree incline, so our hands up, we can see that decreases by around 10%. So if we have a 100-kilogram athlete in a regular push-up, the load that he supports at his hand, he or she supports at their hand, is 70 kilograms. If they happen to have a 150-kilogram bench press, well, we can see that to be working at a reasonable intensity, let's say 80% 1RM, so 120 kilograms, well, they would need to apply a load of around 50 kilograms. So certainly a backpack comes into play then, and those who are lucky or fortunate, or unfortunate enough to have little children, they can also pop on the shoulder blades there and have a sit down to get that load in. Okay, now if we look down this column here, with reference to the power push-up, we can see that actually just utilizing no load at all in these sort of movements, incline, decline, or flat, we're actually in a nice sweet spot for power loading in the upper body movements. So we can see that in a bench throw, peak power occurs at around 30% 1RM, and 40% 1RM is not far off of that. So here we go, from an incline standpoint, we can do a power push-up and really be hitting the sweet spot in terms of power outputs. Obviously, we can go higher up the loads and do power push-ups off of the flat and with the feet up. Now, my preference is for the flat, to be honest, and one of the reasons why is, of course, we're not completely comparing apples with apples here when we look at a push-up and a bench press. Obviously, the push-up itself is more of a decline bench press rather than a flat bench press per se. However, look, we're not publishing papers here. We're just trying to provide a really high-intensity neuromuscular strength training stimulus for our athletes. So let's not be too nitpicky about it. Now, another way to keep your athletes accountable for their power push-ups is, yeah, for sure, add in the old school clap. Add in 2 claps. Add in a clap, a chest tap, and then a catch. But the key thing is that we're trying to catch with our arms straight. The other option is also to push up onto a box and catch on a box. We have the same issues here with box hops or box jumps, and that is not landing in straight positions, but rather flexing to get up into that position. So look, a little bit of honesty here, a little bit of coaching remotely can help with your athletes here to keep them accountable for this. But nonetheless, a really substantial substitute for a bench throw, for example. Now, when we talk about vertical pulling, very difficult, unfortunately. I don't have anywhere where I can pull in my house in terms of vertical pulling. So all the children's playgrounds and whatnot down the park are closed at the moment. We can't access them. So I actually don't have anywhere where I can demonstrate this. But look, I think most people have got some way of being able to do some vertical pulling. And obviously in this case, with a chin up or a pull up, your body weight alone provides a significant load. We can apply more load through our backpacks. And of course, we can even make this more isometric. Use your straps, your makeshift straps to strap yourself in a low bar, and then put excessive loading, or even use a partner to sit on your legs or hold your legs down and pull isometrically against it. Same sort of training protocols apply when you're using the isometrics. And to give you a bit more of a reference point in terms of loading here, look, most of my stronger athletes will be able to vertically pull about 50% of their mass as additional load. So we can see that even in strong guys, the body weight alone is probably representing around 66 to 70% of their 1RM loadings. And therefore, certainly a load worthy of some sort of hypertrophy stimulus, and really showing that only a little bit more load added, whether that's through a backpack, which can easily get 20 kilos to 30 kilos in, then we're actually providing a really, really high neuromuscular stimulus in terms of maximal strength adaptations. So, putting it all together, random selection of exercises, how do we make it all fit? Well, now I've purposely not included reps and sets in some of the examples I'm about to show, because it really depends, and I motion with my inverted commas in the air. In fact, even the choice of exercises and how they're structured within the session and within the week is a big it depends. Nonetheless, here's a few examples of how you might want to structure your athlete strength program using some of these exercises that I've just gone through. So this one here is an example of a complex training program. We'll essentially go from a higher load exercise to a lower load exercise or more explosive exercise. So for example here, iso acceleration with your car, and then a loaded box jump. Over here, loaded one leg squat. Again, a nice heavy squat with your backpack, and then we're going to box hop, for example. The other thing I want you to notice here is, see how we've not completely disregarded some of our lower load auxiliary corrective type work? You know, Copenhagen long lever, Spanish squat. Now, we're not completely throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So these supportive exercises still remain an important part of the program, but we're just shifting our emphasis really to high intensity neuromuscular strength training exercises. I should add here that all of these programs have to dovetail with essentially the running program or the conditioning program that is actually planned, and also the sport program if there's any skill work and whatnot that's going into the sports program during the week. So ultimately, a bit of a juggling act to find out what fits best with your unique scenarios. But here's another option. It's a lower body, upper body split, and it's also a force speed bias split. So you can see Monday and Tuesday are a bit more force biased, and then the Thursday and Friday sessions are a bit more speed biased. And again, Monday being an upper body session, Tuesday a lower body session, and then the Thursday we repeat that again, Thursday being upper body and lower body on the Friday. Now looking at more of an adapted conjugate type training protocol. So now on Monday we have a max effort day, and it's a big day. I'd seriously consider if we're going to be doing this many grinding sessions. So when we're looking again at building up to maximal intensities and using 100% efforts, for example, there's a lot of grinding here. My terminology again, in this day. Now that is extremely sapping. However, if we're only doing that on the one day, perhaps we can get away with just doing it the once a week, because on the Wednesday it's more of a dynamic effort, and on the Friday we come back to our basics. In fact, what we're probably doing now with lighter loads most of the time, and just revisit some repeated effort work. So again, Monday is going to dig a bit of a hole, and Wednesday we can then go express a little bit of power with lighter loads, and then a repeat effort day on the Friday. Again, we can be sensible looking at prescription. You might have a knee iso push grind at 100% all out intensity, and you might do 5 sets of 5-second efforts, and that's heaps. And then what you might do for the rest of your iso pushes, you might drop that right back down to 80%. You might do some longer, more therapeutic efforts, not as much volume, and leave it at that, although it's still a grind, 80%, so in the strength zone, but we're not going all out for every single grind. Again, dependent on your athlete, but I can tell you if you've got a really neuromuscular athlete, someone who's with a sensitive neuromuscular system, then I would suggest that they'll be buried for 3 or 4 days if they're doing grinds. Now, another thing I didn't mention earlier on is obviously isometrics. You're not going to have the same soreness as you would with your isotonics or your eccentric efforts. So there is the ability to have more frequency of training, but ultimately what I'm sort of providing now is probably suffice to be able to get really strong neuromuscular adaptations and essentially flatten the slope. But more importantly, some of these things, specifically if they're novel and they're different exercises, you probably find that a lot of your athletes following these sort of structures will actually enhance their neuromuscular abilities. And you'll find them coming back ready to take on the season, whether that be a congested season or a very, very short turnaround between a sort of pseudo preseason into the regular season. So in closing, look, from more of a political standpoint, let's stay at home, let's flatten the curve, let's do what we're doing. We're doing really well at the moment and here in Australia, but also let's make sure we don't have those spike in injuries. Let's make sure we can get all of our athletes back on the field, competing and seeing who the best teams and individuals are out there. So let's flatten the slope, make sure our athletes come back in a great neuromuscular standing and able to be resilient and at least stave the injuries as much as possible. Thanks for your time.